Welcome to this week's Student Experience podcast. Joining us today is the National Union of Students President, Desiree Kai. Thanks for joining us, Desiree. And I guess to start off with, it'd be really great to hear a bit about your own experiences as a student.
Yeah, sure thing. So I'm currently enrolled as an art student at the University of Melbourne. And I guess when I first started university, I was an interstate student. I moved from Sydney to Melbourne, and I got really involved in my student union as an interstate student because I guess it was the best way to reach out to the university community and make friends and engage in like things that I was really excited about. Or like volunteering and doing things like that. And so that's kind of how I got involved in this whole student representation thing. And I've kind of been involved ever since my first year.
Awesome. And with that representation, because I know you've been on a student representative council as well as your student union element. So what are some of the insights that you can share with us about from other students that you know?
Yeah, I guess the university experience can be so diverse and different depending on who you are and where you come from, and I guess like what your personal situation is. You have students all the way from students staying at home with their parents, working a job, they're having a pretty good time with it, they're going out to parties, and very lucky in doing that. People who have moved out of home who might be struggling to pay rent, or cope with the stress of working and also keeping up with the study load. It's really, really diverse. And I guess universities are so large currently, and there's a whole range of very different people, especially since the demand-driven system was started, and you have a whole range of people who never used to go to university who are attending now. So I think university's changed quite a lot actually in the past few decades, and probably for the better to open up to more people, but also in some ways perhaps in worrying ways which we should look to sort of fix as a general sector and as students as well.
Yeah, and so can you tell us a bit more about what you think the current challenges are with the university sector, and in terms of from a student experience, and ways that you think we could change or look to take a different approach going forward?
Yeah, definitely. So I think from a student perspective, you can point to a lot of different, very individualized issues that students face. On the one hand, you have student welfare issues where students, their counselling services are being cut, they're being understaffed, so students are having to wait for 2 weeks for an appointment if they need counselling assistance urgently. For academic support services, you find that students are struggling to kind of get the help they need on campus potentially, especially at larger campuses. Yeah, so on the one hand, you have those welfare issues, and on the other, there's, I guess, even the barrier to entry in the first place. Obviously, HEQS is a really good system, which means that a lot of domestic students have the opportunity to go and think about their debt later, but obviously that the amount that fees cost is increasing, and then you have an increasing number of postgraduate students and international students who are paying lots and lots of money for the degrees as well. And so alongside that, you have government cuts to education more broadly, and as a result, you have universities not being able to provide as many of those services I talked about before, or having to increase class sizes and things like that. And a lot of the individual issues that we've seen pop up on campuses, so for example, at the University of New South Wales, students are really concerned about the new compulsory trimester model, and universities have pushed that through without consultation. Or at the University of Wollongong, you have the Ramsay Centre, which is essentially paying the university to run a course for a sort of, the Ramsay Centre is like a think tank that perhaps has some controversial ideas, and the University of Wollongong has bypassed its normal procedures in order to get the funding and run this course, which a lot of students and staff are really concerned about. And so you see all these, even the exploitation of international students in the way that they don't have support, and you hear massive stories about inequities with like the language requirements and just trying to get as many students into universities as possible, and the idea that perhaps they're just seen as revenue raisers. There's such a diverse range of issues that students are facing at university, and I think that throughout my time as a student representative, I've seen more and more how like they look like individual issues, but in essence they are quite linked. You know, at the end of the day, the fact that the university sector has to rely on private funding, so funding from individuals instead of the government, is a massive barrier to access to providing adequate services. And because of that, increasing commercialization or corporatization of universities, and you hear the term degree factory used a lot, that's something that increasingly can be seen as the issue that's tying all these disparate student issues together. So that was a very, very, very long-winded answer. And I think, yeah, there are a lot of issues. And yeah, I think my hypothesis from being a student representative is that the corporatization of universities is somewhat to blame.
Yeah, and it's, I think, like you're saying, with so many other things, it's almost as a result of all the other pressures and the other factors that's the route that they've gone down.
Completely.
And I think it's also probably not dissimilar to the arguments for, you know, a not-for-profit organisation where they still have to make a profit, but that's not the core driver. And I think sometimes, you know, it sort of almost feels with some universities that it's becoming more of a business as opposed to about the students. Whereas,
completely.
and that's where it kind of gets a bit concerning.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, like it is, like universities are, you know, they have charity status. They're supposed to be for the betterment of our society, but increasingly moves, like you even see like the salaries of vice chancellors are comparable to that of large business CEOs. You know, why is that the case when we're supposed to be non-for-profit, you know, charity sort of organizations for the betterment of society and for our public good?
So tell me a bit about, and talking about the change of universities and how TAFEs and universities and, you know, all the other, I guess, education providers are now sort of much more interlinked with different pathways. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting one. Coming from a student perspective, and perhaps as some, like, you know, looking at myself a few years ago when I was coming out of high school and looking at my options for education post high school, I wasn't really met with that much. I came from an environment where it was quite expected that you went to university, and I think that's the thing that they say, you know, high achieving students, those who are well off, those who have the option, you should go to university rather than anywhere else. And I think that does a massive disservice to our entire population of young people who want to be educated and who want to contribute to society in meaningful ways after being educated. Sorry, there's a phone call going on in the back. We'll just wait for the voicemail to ring out.
You know, it's really funny because when I finished high school, and I was down in Victoria, because I grew up in Bendigo, and it was very much, I was going into accounting, and it was, do I go down the university theoretical, get a degree path, or do I go to TAFE where I sort of had this belief that it would be much more practical, and what I'd come out with at the end would be something that, or skills that were a lot more tangible than just the theory based. And I know for me, in more recent conversations with students, it's almost like that's shifted. Not so much that we're thinking, although we do in a lot of universities now have a lot more practical elements with, and on placement and things like that, but it was almost like TAFE kind of disappeared as a legitimate option, whereas now hopefully it's starting to come back again.
Yeah, I think people are realizing that they're probably not getting as much out of their university degrees as they thought that they would. And obviously there is that demand for industry-specific practical skills. Universities are currently trying to fill that hole, right? You have universities running unsuccessful work-integrated learning programs, ones that students complain about a lot, and because they haven't really been given the tangible option of going to TAFE instead if they want that practical hands-on knowledge. And then at the same time, you have the need for qualifications as well. Like what are you going to get out of a Cert 3 versus having the word bachelor next to your name, you know? And that's something that's new. from what I've heard, TAFEs are now offering bachelor's degrees that are much more practical and based with connections to industry, but it's the bachelor qualification that's also this new demand that students have. So students want better, industry connection, practical experiences, but they also want the qualification that says, I'm more highly qualified, And so that's a hard thing for the entire sector to sort of balance. And I don't think that it's been done very well currently. Obviously, TAFEs have had their funding cut by subsequent governments for the past, couple of years. And private providers, the regulation of like RTOs who provide certificates is ridiculous. There are like 4,000 RTOs for training purposes in all of Australia. That's insane. And I think in some ways, higher education, the entire post-secondary education sector is so much more complex than it used to be. It's sort of like an analogy I heard recently was, it's a salad that can't be unstirred. Like you've deregulated postgraduate degrees, you've like the international market is this big thing, in the side that we really have to consider. And TAFEs and vocational education aren't seen as legitimate options. The government option, which is, the one that can be regulated the best, is like the government doesn't really care for funding it at all. So we have this massive problem. It's all a mess in higher education. And I think it's because of all the different moves, the demand-driven system, moving back to away from the demand-driven system, all of those things, and the way that also the public narrative around higher education has changed because of those, it can't be undone. And the way forward is very messy because of that.
And what do you think, or what are your thoughts around where you have universities that have actually got a TAFE component to it? So like I know Swinburne has Swinburne TAFE and higher ed. I know CQ University up here does, and there's a couple of others. What are your thoughts in terms of how that changes that playing field?
Yeah, I think that's interesting. I think from what I've heard of like those institutions, like a student at RMIT, which is a mixed mode institution, they get better experiences of like things like industry integrated learning than at a place like Melbourne University. So I think there are benefits to that sort of a model. And yeah, it's a really interesting path that we have to go down with that as well. And I think it's worthwhile.
Cool.
I think also perhaps more broadly, there is this universities and vocational education institutes, they kind of, are head to head in like fighting for government funding and that sort of a thing. And I think that it really shouldn't be that way. So perhaps those dual sort of institutions can show a way where we can work together as the sectors and restore TAFE or vocational education to what it formerly was in Australia.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting opportunity, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, just I guess as a final question from me, what role do you see that universities or TAFEs, depending on where the students are studying, what role do they have in actually ensuring that all students have access to proper student support and a positive student experience?
Yeah, I think universities and other educational providers have a really big role in doing that. Obviously, universities are a bit different in the space than vocational education providers because they're much bigger, much more well-resourced. There might be a difference between a private provider who's much smaller, only has like 100 students, versus a university who has 50,000 students. A university with 50,000 students can run its own counselling program and hire its own, counsellors. At a smaller institute, you might go about that by, partnering up with Headspace in your local area or doing something like that. And I think that there is a large responsibility for those education institutes to take care of the well-being of their students. You look at the increasingly internationalized market, you look at increasingly vulnerable students, And for a lot of people who move interstate or move internationally to study, universities are really their only support circle when they first come here. Their closest friends are only, they've only met them for like a couple of weeks. You don't have, like, if you're a domestic student, you might have your local GP, you might have your local sports team, and those are all circles. You might have your parents, you can rely on them. But if you've moved away to go to university, then, university is kind of the only support base that you have, the only place that you can go as a first port of call. And so I think universities have to take that responsibility really, really seriously. Obviously, it's not the same as high school. We're all adults now at this point. But you can look at it also in the context of the fact that youth allowance and New Start is way below the poverty line. Students, used to get by just working a summer job. Now students are working an average, a third of students are working more than 20 hours a week because they have to pay for rent. And what does that impact on, the way that you can study? Do you need to record lectures? Do you need to have better special consideration sort of processes? These are all questions I think universities have to take quite seriously, because you can't just expect students to rock up as, just students anymore. Students are carers, they're parents, they're struggling to get by, they're living under the poverty line. So there's a whole degree of nuance, and it takes money, really. It takes funding and commitment from universities to really deal with that adequately.
Yeah, and it's really insightful, because I know, as a domestic student, I've never really thought of that whole, you turn up in a country and yes, you've got to find somewhere to live, but you, as you say, you don't have a doctor, you don't have, your medical records, how do you find where you need to go? And, it's one of those things that I think unless you've had that lived experience, or someone who's had that lived experience, it's really hard to even realise that those are issues that people are facing.
Completely. Yeah. And I think it's like, this is why student representation is also so important, right? Your student representatives get to talk to students who have a whole range of different backgrounds and issues. And I remember being a student representative on campus at Melbourne University and bringing these issues up to university management who had no idea, So it's obviously really important to have that voice there.
So that's all the questions I had. Was there anything else that you wanted to share before we finish up?
Maybe a quick plug. I don't know when this podcast is coming out, but the National Union of Students is partnering with a bunch of other student representative organisations on a national level. Council of Postgrads, the Council of International Students, the two Indigenous students peak bodies, and we all sit on the TEQSA Student Expert Advisory Group together, and we're running a joint campaign called Our Universities in Our Hands, or Our Education in Our Hands, really, focusing on, providing an alternative narrative for universities to be for the public good, not private profit. And so we have a campaign launch coming up actually this week, so maybe it's too soon to plug, but we have a Facebook page, Our Education in Our Hands, and we'll be running that campaign and hopefully a bunch of events to try and reframe universities and higher education in Australia.
That sounds great. And so is that going through to 2020, or is that kind of just towards the end of this year?
We're trying to make this a long campaign, hopefully, for the next few years.
That sounds really exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Well, thank you very much for joining us today. It's been really, really insightful, and I've loved listening to it. And that's it for today's session. So thank you very much for joining us, Desiree.
Thanks for having me.